The air inside Aurelia was not merely conditioned, it was curated, a carefully balanced atmosphere of old money and new power. It smelled of leather-bound menus, expensive French perfume, and the faint, earthy aroma of black truffles being shaved over handmade pasta in the distant kitchen. The sound was a hushed symphony of discreet murmurs, the gentle clinking of silver cutlery against fine porcelain, and the almost imperceptible fizz of vintage champagne being poured into crystal flutes. Gilded walls absorbed the light from chandeliers that hung like frozen constellations, casting a warm golden glow upon the faces of titans of industry, political brokers, and hereditary billionaires. In this world, Illyra Vance was a ghost. Her uniform, a simple, impeccably tailored black dress, was designed for invisibility. Her movements were a study in silent efficiency, a choreography she had perfected over 2 long years. She could navigate the cavernous dining room with a full tray of wine glasses held high, her steps so light they barely disturbed the thick Persian rugs. To the patrons of Aurelia, she was not a person but a function, an extension of the restaurant itself, there to anticipate a need and vanish the moment it was met. This practiced anonymity was her armor, a shield against the casual cruelty and dismissive glances of a world she served but could never belong to. Beneath the placid surface of the professional waitress, however, a different reality churned. Illyra's mind was a fortress, and behind its walls, she was not a servant but a guardian. Every perfectly polished wine glass, every flawlessly presented dish, was a small victory in a war no one else knew she was fighting. Each dollar of her meager salary, supplemented by the occasional pitying tip, went directly to a sterile white room on the 3rd floor of the St. Jude's Extended Care Facility. There, her father, a man whose mind once designed revolutionary aerospace navigation systems, lay silent. A catastrophic stroke, brought on by the crushing stress of a corporate espionage frame-up, had stolen his voice, his mobility, and the brilliant spark in his eyes. He had been ruined by a competitor, a corporate predator who had not only stolen his life's work, but had also methodically destroyed his reputation, leaving him a broken shell. Illyra remembered him in his workshop, the smell of solder and hot coffee, his hands, so gentle, now curled and still on a white sheet. The weight of his care, the crushing medical bills, and the desperate fight to maintain his dignity was a physical burden she carried in the constant ache of her shoulders, and the permanent fatigue etched behind her professional smile. This job, this daily exercise in self-effacement, was her penance and her purpose. The muscle memory of her former life was a phantom limb, an echo that resonated in the core of her being. While her hands were steady arranging a dessert fork, they remembered the cold, hard grip of a CQC combat knife. While her eyes scanned the room for an empty water glass, they instinctively mapped exit routes, identified potential threats, and assessed the structural weaknesses of every chair and table. She had once been a decorated operative in a unit so secret it didn't officially exist, Project Chimera. She was a prodigy, a master of a brutal and classified pressure point combat system known as the Lazarus system, designed for instant incapacitation with minimal effort. The training had been relentless, forging her body into a weapon and her mind into a tactical supercomputer. She had left that world behind without a second thought the day her father collapsed, trading her tactical gear for a sommelier's apron. Yet, the training never left her. It was in the way she balanced her weight, the preternatural awareness of her surroundings, the coiled stillness in her posture. She was a dormant weapon, hidden in plain sight, her lethal potential masked by the mundane rituals of fine dining. The delicate equilibrium of the room shifted when Damien Sterling arrived. It was not a loud entrance but a gravitational one, as if the very air condensed around him. The maitre d', a man who greeted senators with casual familiarity, suddenly became a study in obsequious anxiety, his posture bending in a subtle, reverential bow. Sterling was a man sculpted from arrogance and ambition. He wore a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than Alara's annual salary, but it was the aura of untouchable power that was his true uniform. He moved not like a guest, but like an owner inspecting his property. Following a step behind him was a mountain in a suit, a bodyguard named Ajax, whose neck was as thick as Alara's waist. His presence was a blunt statement of force, a walking deterrent. Sterling didn't look at the staff. He looked through them, his eyes scanning the room for his table, as if the people serving him were nothing more than inconvenient pieces of furniture. As he passed, Alara felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. There was a predatory stillness about him that was all too familiar, a soulless confidence she had seen before in the worst of men. Sterling was hosting a potential client, a foreign dignitary whose security contract was worth billions. The entire dinner was a performance, a carefully staged demonstration of Sterling's absolute dominance. He spoke in a loud, confident voice, peppering his speech with corporate jargon and poorly pronounced French phrases to impress his guest. He spoke of assets, of risk mitigation, of impenetrable systems. To illustrate a point about the superiority of his personnel, he gestured dismissively toward Ajax, who stood motionless by the wall. "My assets are unparalleled," Sterling boasted, his voice dripping with condescension. "Take Ajax here. He is a product of my company's most elite training program, a proprietary system. He is, for all intents and purposes, invincible. He feels no pain. He has no weakness. He is less a man and more a weapon, a perfect instrument of my will." He smiled, a thin, cruel slash across his face, enjoying the way his guest's eyes widened in awe. The boast hung in the air, a testament to his hubris, a declaration that even the men who protected him were not people, but property. To punctuate his grand statement, Sterling performed a small, deliberate act of cruelty. With a flick of his wrist, he accidentally knocked over his glass of expensive red wine, sending a splash of crimson liquid across the pristine white tablecloth. The act was so casual, so obviously intentional, that a hush fell over the immediate vicinity. Without a word, Alara moved forward, a clean cloth in her hand, her training kicking in to de-escalate, to clean, to make the problem disappear. She knelt beside the table, her head bowed, focusing only on the stain. As she reached to blot the spill, a hand shot out and clamped around her wrist like a manacle. Sterling's grip was surprisingly strong, his fingers digging into the tender flesh of her forearm. "Not so fast," he sneered, his voice low and menacing. "Your slowness is an inconvenience. Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? Do you have any idea who I am?" He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of aged whiskey and self-importance. The entire performance was for his client, a petty display of power over someone he considered less than human. He tightened his grip, pulling her slightly off balance. "Look at him," Sterling commanded, nodding toward his bodyguard. "My man here could snap you in half without thinking. He's a weapon. You're just a napkin." The insult, so public, so demeaning, was meant to shatter her. But it did something else entirely. As his words echoed in the silent dining room, the image of her father flooded Alara's mind. She saw him in his hospital bed, helpless, his dignity stripped away by a faceless corporation. She saw the stacks of unpaid medical bills on her small kitchen table. She felt the bone-deep exhaustion of working double shifts, of sacrificing her past, her future, her very identity, to care for the man who had given her everything. This billionaire, with his casual cruelty and his boastful pride, was the living embodiment of the force that had destroyed her family. A cold, silent fury began to solidify in her veins, not hot and reckless, but glacial and precise. It steadied her hand, slowed her breathing, and sharpened the world into crystalline focus. The waitress, the ghost, began to fade, and the soldier started to emerge from the shadows. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community. This is a story you won't want to miss, a clash where the forgotten find their voice and the powerful are forced to reckon with the ghosts of their past. The gilded cage of Aurelia is about to become a battleground, and the balance of power is about to shift in a way no one could have ever predicted. The world is about to learn that the most dangerous weapon is the one you never see coming, the one you dismiss as nothing more than a part of the scenery. The shift inside Alara was imperceptible to the outside world, but to her it was a seismic event. The fear and humiliation she was supposed to feel simply evaporated, replaced by an absolute and chilling clarity. The mask of the subservient waitress dissolved, and for the first time in 2 years the operative looked out from behind her eyes. Her posture remained deferential, but the energy within her changed from passive to predatory. Her focus narrowed to a single point, the pressure of Sterling's fingers on her wrist. She looked up, not at his eyes, but at the space just past him, her expression unreadable, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the polite whisper of a server. It was low, steady, and carried a weight that made the air around it feel heavy. "Let me go," she said. It was not a plea. It was a command. Sterling, taken aback by her tone, let out a short, bark-like laugh. He saw her composure, not as a threat, but as an amusing absurdity. "Or what?" he mocked. He turned to Ajax. "Escort her out," he ordered, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Firmly. The giant bodyguard moved forward, his massive hand reaching for Alara's arm, ready to drag the insignificant waitress out of his master's sight. The world contracted into the space between Alara and the approaching mountain of a man. Time itself seemed to stretch and thin, each heartbeat a slow, deliberate drum against her ribs. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of conversation, all of it faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. In its place, the sound of her own breathing became a controlled, rhythmic anchor in the storm of impending violence. Ajax's hand, a slab of meat and bone capable of crushing steel, reached for her. It was not a gentle touch he intended, but a seizure, an act of possession meant to haul her away like a sack of refuse. Her mind, a supercomputer awakened from a long slumber, processed the trajectory of his arm, the angle of his shoulder, the slight shift in his weight from his back foot to his front. It was a clumsy, telegraphed movement, predicated on the absolute certainty that his target was helpless. This was the fatal flaw of all bullies, the arrogant assumption of their own invincibility, a blind spot her training was specifically designed to exploit. The ghost of her instructor's voice echoed in the silent theater of her mind. A weapon's greatest strength is its predictability. As his fingers were a mere inch from her arm, the world snapped back into motion, but it was a motion she now controlled completely. Her body, coiled with a potential energy that had been suppressed for 2 agonizing years, unwound in a single, fluid movement that was too fast for the untrained eye to properly register. It was not an act of aggression, but of perfect, brutal physics. Instead of pulling away, she moved into his attack, her left hand coming up not to block, but to guide. Her palm met the inside of his wrist, her fingers wrapping around the thick tendons with practiced ease. She did not fight his momentum, she borrowed it, redirecting the entire force of his forward lunge away from her body and outward, causing his enormous frame to stumble slightly, his balance momentarily compromised. It was an effortless redirection, like a riverstone diverting the course of a raging current. In that single, fleeting moment of imbalance, he was no longer a weapon. He was a liability, his own strength turned against him, a vulnerability she had been trained to see as a gaping, undefended doorway. The entire sequence, from his lunge to her redirection, took less than half a second, a blur of motion that defied the expectations of everyone watching. The second part of the sequence was a whisper of violence, a lethal ballet. As his arm was extended and his body was overcommitted, Alara's right hand, which had been hanging loosely at her side, became a surgical instrument. Her fingers, held in a rigid, spear-like formation, drew a precise, invisible line through the air. The first target was a specific nerve cluster located just below his ear, at the junction of the neck and jaw, the brachial plexus. Her fingertips made contact with a sound no louder than a soft tap, but the effect was catastrophic. A jolt of pure, bioelectric fire surged through Ajax's nervous system, a system-wide shutdown command that bypassed his conscious thought entirely. His arm, the one reaching for her, went instantly and completely limp, all strength and motor function ceasing, as if a switch had been flipped deep within his brain. His eyes widened in a silent scream of confusion and shock as his own body betrayed him, refusing to obey the commands his mind was desperately trying to send. He felt no pain, only a profound and terrifying nothingness where his strength used to be. It was the first note in a symphony of incapacitation. Before the first shockwave had even finished traversing his nervous system, Alara's hand was already moving to its second target. Her movement was a continuous, flowing arc, a testament to thousands of hours of relentless training that had carved these motions into her very soul. As his head involuntarily snapped to the side from the first strike, it exposed a second critical pressure point at the top of his shoulder, where the suprascapular nerve lay close to the surface. Her hand descended again, another precise, calculated tap that sent a second, decisive signal of paralysis through his upper body. The combined effect of the two strikes was absolute. The Lazarus system was not designed to injure, it was designed to erase, to temporarily delete a person's ability to function as a threat. The signals from Ajax's brain to his limbs were now completely severed. He was a statue, trapped inside a body that was no longer his to command. His legs, deprived of the signals needed to support his immense weight, simply gave way beneath him. The Titan crumbled. Ajax collapsed without a sound, a silent, ignominious heap of muscle and tailored fabric. He did not fall so much as fold, his body deflating onto the plush Persian rug with a soft, heavy thud that seemed to echo in the cavernous silence that had now consumed the entire restaurant. He landed at Alara's feet, his eyes wide open, staring up at the gilded ceiling, fully conscious but utterly and completely paralyzed from the neck down. A thin sheen of sweat beaded on his forehead, the only outward sign of the sheer terror and confusion raging within his imprisoned mind. The invincible bodyguard, the perfect weapon Sterling had boasted of, was neutralized. He was a monument to his master's hubris, defeated not by superior strength, but by a superior knowledge of the human body's hidden frailties. The entire devastatingly effective sequence, from the moment he reached for her to the moment he hit the floor, had taken less than 2 seconds. In the wake of his collapse, a profound, tomb-like stillness descended upon Aurelia. Every diner was frozen, forks halfway to their mouths, conversations cut off mid-sentence. The only sound was the faint, melodic hum of the crystal chandeliers. For a long moment, Damien Sterling's face was a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. His mind, accustomed to a world that bent to his will, simply could not process the data its eyes were providing. He saw his bodyguard, his invincible asset, lying helpless on the floor. He saw the waitress, the insignificant napkin, standing over him, her posture calm, her breathing even, her expression a blank slate of professional detachment. The scene was so utterly impossible, so completely outside the established laws of his universe, that for a horrifying second, he thought he might be hallucinating. The sight of a fly defeating a lion would have been more plausible. His brain cycled through a frantic, desperate search for an explanation. Had Ajax slipped? Had he suffered a sudden aneurysm? Any possibility was preferable to the one that was slowly dawning in the deepest, most terrified corners of his mind. A truth so monstrous it threatened to shatter his entire perception of control. Then, the recognition hit him like a physical blow. a shard of ice driven straight into his heart. It wasn't the collapse itself that terrified him. It was the way it happened. The fluid, economical motion. The precise two-point contact. The instantaneous, non-violent incapacitation. He had seen it before, not in person, but in grainy, top-secret demonstration videos shown only to him and a handful of Pentagon officials. It was the signature of his most proprietary, most secret, most expensive creation. It was the Lazarus system. The technique taught only to the hand-picked, ghost-like operatives of Project Chimera, his personal, off-the-book Special Forces unit. A system he owned, a system he controlled, a system whose every practitioner he believed he knew by name and number. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pale sheen. This wasn't just an assault. This was an impossibility. It was a ghost from his own machine, standing in a waitress uniform in the middle of his favorite restaurant. The implications of this revelation cascaded through his mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Who was this woman? Was she a plant from a rival corporation? An agent from a foreign government who had somehow infiltrated his most secure program? Was she a rogue operative? A loose end he didn't even know existed? The paranoia was a living thing, clawing at the inside of his skull. His entire empire was built on the perception of impenetrable security, of possessing assets and technologies that no one else could touch. This woman, this nobody, had just taken his most valuable secret and used it against him in public, in front of a client he was trying to impress. She had not just disarmed his bodyguard, she had disarmed his entire mystique of power. She had proven, in 2 devastating seconds, that his world was not as secure as he believed. The fear was a cold, coiling serpent in his gut, a primal terror he had not felt since he was a child. He was exposed, vulnerable, and he had no idea how deep the breach went. The raw, primal fear, too much for his ego to bear, rapidly curdled into a volcanic, uncontrollable rage. Humiliation was a poison in his veins. He, Damian Sterling, a master of the universe, had been undone by a servant. His face, once pale with shock, now flushed a deep, mottled crimson. A vein throbbed violently in his temple. The carefully constructed facade of the sophisticated, untouchable billionaire shattered into a million pieces, revealing the screaming, terrified tyrant beneath. He pointed a trembling finger at Ilara, his hand shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. His voice, when it finally broke the suffocating silence, was not the confident baritone of a CEO, but a raw, ragged shriek that was ugly and shrill. "You!" he screamed, the word tearing from his throat. "Who are you? What did you do?" It was a question born not of curiosity, but of pure, unadulterated panic. He was no longer in control, and the loss of that control had driven him to the brink of madness. The restaurant manager, a perpetually nervous man named Monsieur Dubois, finally broke from his paralysis and scurried toward the table, his face a mask of professional horror. He had spent his entire career managing the delicate egos of the world's most powerful people, but he had no protocol for this. He saw a billionaire screaming, a bodyguard motionless on the floor, and a waitress standing amidst the wreckage with an unnerving, almost supernatural calm. "Mr. Sterling, sir, is everything all right? What has happened?" Dubois stammered, his hands fluttering uselessly at his sides. Sterling rounded on him, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "All right?" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the gilded walls. "Does this look all right to you? This thing assaulted my employee. She attacked him. I want her arrested. I want her fired. I want her out of my sight now." He was a king whose castle had been breached, and his only response was to scream for the guards to execute the peasant who had dared to pull back the curtain. Sterling's tirade was not just about the immediate incident. It was a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative, to re-establish his dominance through sheer volume and fury. He turned his attention back to Alara, his words now a torrent of threats, each one designed to utterly annihilate her. "You have no idea who you just crossed," he hissed, his voice dropping to a low, venomous snarl that was somehow more frightening than his shouting. "I will own you. I will file a lawsuit so massive it will follow your family for generations. I will have you blacklisted from every service industry database on the planet. You won't be able to get a job washing dishes in a back alley diner. You are finished. Do you understand me? You are nothing, and I will spend a fortune to make sure you remain nothing." The threats were specific, clinical, and delivered with the cold promise of a man who had destroyed countless lives before and would have no qualms about destroying one more. He was not just trying to punish her, he was trying to erase her from existence. Throughout the verbal assault, Alara remained perfectly still. The operative within her had receded slightly, and the woman, the daughter, was now looking at the man who was screaming at her. She wasn't listening to the words of the threats themselves, but to the timbre of his voice, the arrogant set of his jaw, the soulless cruelty in his eyes. And in that moment, a suspicion she had harbored for years, a dark and formless shadow at the back of her mind, finally solidified into a terrible, undeniable certainty. She had seen that face before, not in person, but in old news articles her father used to keep. Articles about a brilliant young tech mogul named Damian Sterling, who was revolutionizing the defense industry. She remembered the name of his company, Sterling Defense Systems. The same company that had outbid her father for a crucial government contract just months before his technology was stolen and his life was ruined. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered for years, now slammed together in her mind with the force of a physical impact. This wasn't a random act of cruelty from a random billionaire. This was him. This was the architect of her family's pain. A new kind of coldness settled over her, a feeling far deeper and more profound than the tactical calm she had felt moments before. It was the coldness of a truth so monstrous it froze the very marrow in her bones. The humiliation, the job, the threats, all of it became insignificant, fading into the background noise of a much larger, much older war. Her fight was not with a rude customer in a restaurant. Her fight was with the man who had stolen her father's soul and left him a living ghost. The man who had forced her to trade a life of honor and purpose for one of servitude and invisibility. The man who, in his boundless arrogance, had just boasted about the very weapons system that was built upon the ruins of her family. The irony was so bitter, so profound, it almost made her want to laugh. He had no idea that the weapon he was so proud of was being wielded by the daughter of the man he had so casually destroyed. The universe, it seemed, had a dark and poetic sense of justice. Monsieur Dubois, desperate to appease the erupting volcano that was Damian Sterling, finally turned to Alara, his expression a pitiful mix of fear and apology. "Miss Vance," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Please, you must go. Collect your things. You are terminated." The words, which should have been devastating, barely registered. Losing her job was like losing a stone from her pocket after discovering her entire house had burned down. It was a secondary, meaningless loss. She gave the manager a slow, deliberate nod, her gaze never leaving Sterling's face. She held his furious, terrified eyes for a long, silent moment, and in that gaze, she let him see it. She let him see the flicker of recognition, the dawning of a new and terrible understanding. She was no longer just a problem to be disposed of. She was a witness. She was a reckoning. And she was not afraid of him. Not anymore. Without another word, she turned and walked away from the table. Her movements were not hurried or shameful. They were measured, graceful, and imbued with a newfound sense of purpose. She could feel the weight of every eye in the restaurant on her back, but the feeling was different now. It was not the dismissive gaze reserved for a servant, but a stare of stunned, fearful respect. They had just witnessed the impossible, a shift in the fundamental balance of power. The ghost of Aurelia had become a solid, undeniable presence. As she walked through the opulent dining room, past the tables of billionaires and brokers, she was no longer just Elara Vance, the waitress. She was a soldier leaving a battlefield, the first shot in her private war having been fired, and the victory, though costly, was absolute. She had drawn first blood, and her enemy now knew, with bone-deep certainty, that he was being hunted. The transition from the curated warmth of the dining room to the sterile, fluorescent-lit functionality of the employee-only areas was always jarring, but tonight it felt like crossing a border into a different reality. The sounds of clattering pans and shouting chefs from the kitchen, usually a source of chaotic comfort, now seemed distant and muffled. She walked to her small metal locker, her steps echoing in the quiet hallway. Her hands moved with an automaton's precision, unbuttoning the simple black uniform that had been her cage for 2 years. As the fabric fell away, it felt like shedding a skin, a constricting layer of imposed identity that she had worn for far too long. Beneath it, she was not weaker, but stronger, the uniform having served not as armor, but as a suppressor, dampening the person she was truly meant to be. She was no longer hiding. It was only when she was dressed in her own simple clothes, jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, that the full weight of her situation finally descended upon her. The tactical adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation began to recede, leaving in its place a vast, empty space. In that space, a cold, creeping dread began to bloom. The reality was stark and brutal. She was unemployed. Her only source of income, the meager lifeline that paid for her father's specialized care, his medicine, his sterile room at the facility, was gone. The image of the stack of overdue bills on her small kitchen table flashed in her mind, each one a paper shackle. For a terrifying moment, the despair was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest that made it hard to breathe. Sterling's threats echoed in her ears. He would not just let her go. He would actively hunt her, ensuring that every door was closed to her. How could she possibly fight a man like that? A man who could buy and sell armies, when she could no longer afford to keep her father alive. She leaned her forehead against the cool metal of the locker, closing her eyes. The scent of industrial cleaning solution and stale air filled her nostrils. The despair threatened to swallow her whole, to drag her down into a dark, suffocating abyss of hopelessness. It would be so easy to give in, to accept that she was powerless, that she had made a terrible, life-altering mistake. But then another image rose to the surface of her mind, pushing back against the darkness. It was the face of her father, not as he was now, silent and still, but as he had been. She saw him in his workshop, his face lit by the glow of a computer screen, his eyes sparkling with the joy of creation. She heard his voice, a deep and gentle rumble, explaining the complex beauty of orbital mechanics to her when she was just a child. She remembered the unwavering belief he had in her, the way he told her she could be anything she wanted to be, that her strength was not in her fists, but in her mind and her heart. The memory was a fire, a small, defiant flame that the despair could not extinguish. The cold dread in her stomach did not vanish, but it began to change, to transmute. The fear for her father's future, the raw terror of her own powerlessness, began to solidify, to crystallize into something else entirely. It became a cold, hard, and perfectly clear diamond of resolve. The anger she felt was no longer a hot, blinding rage, but a focused, controlled burn. It was the anger of righteous fury, the fury of a daughter whose father's legacy had been desecrated. She had not made a mistake. For the first time in 2 years, she had done something right. She had stopped being a passive victim of circumstance and had become an agent of her own destiny. She had been hiding, surviving, enduring. Now it was time to fight back. She pushed herself off the locker, her spine straight, her shoulders back. The fatigue that had been her constant companion for years seemed to have vanished, burned away by the intensity of her newfound purpose. She looked at her own reflection in a small, cracked mirror hanging on the wall. The face staring back was not that of a defeated waitress. The eyes were clear, sharp, and focused. They were the eyes of the operative, the prodigy of Project Chimera. The skills Sterling had paid a fortune to forge into her were not his property to command. They were hers, and she was about to turn his own investment against him. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer a paralyzing force, it was fuel. It was a reminder of what was at stake. It was the whetstone against which she would sharpen her resolve. Walking out of the back alley of Aurelia and into the cold, damp air of the New York City night was like being born into a new world. The city sounds, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a passing subway train, the cacophony of 1,000 different lives intersecting, no longer felt overwhelming. They felt like a promise, a vast urban wilderness in which she could move, plan, and strike. She was a ghost once more, but this time, it was by her own design. She was no longer hiding from the world. She was using the shadows as her shield, her anonymity now a weapon instead of a prison. The city was not a threat, it was a tactical landscape, a board on which a new game was about to be played. And she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she was no longer the pawn. The long subway ride back to her small Spartan apartment in Queens was not a journey of defeat, but a tactical briefing with herself. Her mind, now fully unshackled from the mundane worries of a waitress, began to work with a speed and clarity she had not experienced in years. She compartmentalized the problem. Objective, justice for her father. Target, Damian Sterling. Obstacles, Sterling's immense wealth, power, and legal resources. Her own lack of funds and access. Assets, her specialized training, her intimate knowledge of his most secret security system, and the element of complete surprise. He knew what she could do, but he had no idea who she was, or what was motivating her. His arrogance, the very thing that made him so powerful, was now his greatest vulnerability. He would never see her coming, because he was fundamentally incapable of believing that someone like her could pose a genuine threat. When she arrived at her apartment, the sight of the stacked medical bills on her table no longer filled her with a sense of dread. She looked at them differently now. They were not a symbol of her debt, they were a dossier of Sterling's crimes. Each invoice was a piece of evidence, a quantifiable measure of the damage he had inflicted. She sat down at her small kitchen table and, for the first time, allowed herself to map out the full scope of his villainy. He hadn't just stolen a piece of technology. He had stolen her father's health, his reputation, his future. He had stolen her career, her peace of mind, her youth. The debt he owed was not measured in dollars, but in years of stolen life. And it was a debt she was now fully prepared to collect, with interest. From a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard in her closet, she retrieved a piece of her former life, a ruggedized, heavily encrypted laptop. It was a relic, a ghost of a past she had tried to bury, but she had never been able to bring herself to destroy it. Wiping the dust from its casing, she felt a jolt of familiarity, the muscle memory of a life defined by secrets and high stakes. She powered it on, and the screen flickered to life, demanding a series of complex, alphanumeric passphrases. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, the old codes and protocols coming back to her as if she had used them only yesterday. The system booted up not into a commercial operating system, but into a secure, untraceable network. The secure network was a ghost world, a silent, text-based reality of command prompts and encrypted data streams that felt more like home than any physical place she had inhabited for years. The glow of the laptop screen cast her face in a cool, blue light, her features a mask of intense concentration. Her apartment, with its peeling paint and rattling window frames, faded into insignificance. This was her new battlefield, a landscape of pure information where deception was armor and knowledge was a weapon. The first step, however, was not an assault, but a reconnaissance mission of the soul. She needed an ally, someone from her past who understood the world she came from and the nature of the beast she was now hunting. There was only one name that came to mind, a name that carried the weight of integrity and the quiet authority of a man who had seen the true face of power and had not flinched. General Marcus Thorne, retired. He had been the commander of Project Chimera, a man of profound moral conviction who had always viewed Damian Sterling not as a visionary, but as a necessary evil, a Faustian bargain the government had made for technological superiority. Thorne had seen the darkness in Sterling long before anyone else and had quietly resigned when the project's ethics became too compromised for him to stomach. Reaching him was an exercise in resurrecting old ghosts. A standard phone call or email was unthinkable. Every form of modern communication was a potential listening post for a man like Sterling. Instead, she used a protocol they had established for dire emergencies, a system of layered, anonymous communications that felt like a relic from a forgotten war. She sent a single, encrypted packet of data to a long-dormant server in Iceland, a message containing nothing more than a set of GPS coordinates and a timestamp. It was a digital flare, a signal only Thorne would recognize. The coordinates were for a place of shared memory, a location that held a quiet, solemn significance for them both. The granite steps of the New York Public Library, facing the stoic patience of the stone lions. It was a place where spies and soldiers could meet in plain sight, their anonymity guaranteed by the sheer indifferent volume of the city's ceaseless human traffic. She had no way of knowing if he would come, if he even monitored the old channels anymore, but it was a leap of faith she had to take. 2 days later, she sat on the cold stone steps, the weak afternoon sun doing little to warm her. The city flowed around her, a river of yellow cabs and hurried pedestrians. She felt a presence beside her before she saw him. Marcus Thorne had aged, the lines around his eyes deeper, his hair a uniform shade of silver, but his posture was still ramrod straight, the bearing of a man who had commanded respect his entire life. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the bustling street ahead. "I always knew one of Sterling's sins would come back to haunt him," he said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur that was almost lost in the city's noise. "I just never imagined it would be you, Vance." There was no surprise in his tone, only a profound, weary sadness. He had seen her file, knew her potential, and had mourned the loss of a great soldier when she had disappeared from the grid. She didn't need to explain the incident at the restaurant. He had already put the pieces together. The news of a neutralized Sterling bodyguard had traveled fast in the quiet circles he still moved in. She laid out the truth, her voice low and steady, a dispassionate field report on the ruin of her family. She spoke of her father's stolen work, of his broken health, of the 2 years she had spent in a self-imposed exile, scrubbing floors and pouring wine to keep him alive. Thorne listened without interruption, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. When she finished, a long silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken grief and a shared, simmering anger. "Sterling built his empire on the bones of good men," Thorne said finally, his voice laced with a cold fury. "He perverted everything Project Chimera was supposed to stand for, turning a shield into a sword for the highest bidder. I can't give you direct access to his systems, Ilara. I've been out of the game too long, and my digital signature would trigger every alarm he has. But a fortress is only as strong as its weakest wall, and Sterling's weakness has always been his contempt for the people he considers unimportant." He was not just offering sympathy, he was offering a strategy, the first piece of a tactical puzzle. Thorne's guidance was a compass in the wilderness. He couldn't lead her to the target, but he could point her in the right direction. Sterling's digital fortress, he explained, was a state-of-the-art masterpiece of cybersecurity, virtually impenetrable from the outside. But inside it was a kingdom built on fear and intimidation. Sterling promoted loyalty through terror, and such loyalty was brittle. Thorne gave her a name, Leo Martinez, a mid-level data archivist at Sterling Defense Systems. Leo had once been a rising star in the IT department, until he had the audacity to correct one of Sterling's technical assertions during a board meeting. For this public act of competence, he was humiliated and reassigned to the digital catacombs of the company, the server archives, where he was tasked with managing terabytes of old, forgotten data. He was a man with a grudge, a deep and festering resentment, and most importantly, he had high-level access to the historical data servers, the very place where the digital ghost of her father's stolen technology might still reside. Finding Leo was the easy part. Turning him was the challenge. She couldn't approach him as a former operative or a woman seeking vengeance. She had to approach him as a fellow victim. Using her skills in surveillance and social engineering, she spent a week observing him, learning his routines, his habits, the quiet desperation in his posture as he commuted to a job he clearly despised. She finally made her move not in a shadowy alley, but in a crowded coffee shop near his office. She accidentally spilled her coffee on him, a classic, disarming maneuver. In the ensuing flurry of apologies and napkins, she introduced herself as a freelance journalist investigating corporate malpractice. She spoke of anonymous sources, of powerful men crushing the little guy. She didn't mention Sterling by name, but she didn't have to. The fear and recognition in Leo's eyes were immediate. He was terrified, but he was also intrigued. She had planted a seed of rebellion in the barren soil of his resignation. Their subsequent meetings were clandestine and fraught with tension, taking place in the anonymous liminal spaces of the city, a noisy subway platform during rush hour, a forgotten corner of a public park, the back booth of a dimly lit diner. Leo was a man wrestling with his conscience, torn between the very real fear of Sterling's retribution and the desperate desire for a small measure of justice. Ilara never pushed, never threatened. Instead, she listened. She let him vent his years of frustration, his bitterness over his stalled career, his disgust at the corporate culture Sterling had fostered. She validated his anger, showing him that he was not alone in his feeling of powerlessness. She framed the act of helping her not as a betrayal of his company, but as an act of loyalty to his own integrity. Slowly, cautiously, the terrified archivist began to transform into a co-conspirator. He finally agreed to help not for money or for glory, but for the simple, human need to fight back against a bully. Leo became her eyes and ears inside the digital fortress. He couldn't risk a massive data dump. Every transfer was monitored, but he could smuggle out information in tiny, encrypted fragments, hiding them in the metadata of innocuous image files. The first pieces of the puzzle began to arrive on her laptop. They were server logs, access records, and data transfer manifests from 7 years ago, the exact time of her father's professional and personal collapse. The logs showed a massive, multi-terabyte data transfer from a small, independent server, her father's, to a secure, internal Sterling defense server, codenamed Icarus. The transfer was followed, mere hours later, by a remote command that initiated a complete, military-grade data wipe of her father's original server, leaving behind nothing but digital ash. It was a clear, unambiguous timeline of the theft. It was the skeleton of the crime, but it lacked the crucial element, the direct link to Sterling himself. The authorization codes were all encrypted, masked behind layers of corporate security protocols. This was the first major wall in her investigation. The encrypted logs were a dead end. Her skills were in human and physical systems, not in brute force code-breaking. For days, she stared at the strings of alphanumeric gibberish on her screen, a language she could not speak. Frustration began to gnaw at her, a familiar feeling of helplessness that reminded her of the long, silent hours by her father's hospital bed. She was so close, yet the truth was locked away in a digital safe she had no key for. The despair was a cold weight in her stomach, the fear that she had come this far only to fail, to be defeated by a problem she was not equipped to solve. She felt the ghost of the Waitress creeping back, the powerless observer, the victim of forces far beyond her control. The thought of letting her father down, of failing to clear his name, was a torment worse than any physical threat Sterling could muster. In her darkest moment of frustration, she turned away from the cold logic of the computer and toward the warm chaos of memory. She pulled out a dusty, forgotten box from the back of her closet, a box filled with her father's old belongings. It was a painful archaeological dig into a life that had been violently interrupted. She sifted through old notebooks filled with his elegant, spidery handwriting, pages of complex equations interspersed with doodles and personal reflections. She powered up his old, obsolete personal computer, the machine on which he had built his life's work. The machine whirred to life, a mechanical ghost breathing its last. And there, in a folder labeled Personal, she found it. It wasn't a password or a key. It was a digital journal, a series of notes he had written to himself during the development of his navigation system. He wrote about his coding philosophy, his belief that true elegance in design was like a signature, a unique and inimitable style. He described a backdoor he had built into his own encryption, a failsafe based not on a password, but on a specific, recursive algorithm derived from the Fibonacci sequence, a mathematical pattern he had always found beautiful. The realization struck her with the force of a lightning bolt. Sterling's engineers were brilliant, but they were arrogant. They had stolen the house, but had likely never bothered to check the architect's hidden passages. They had wrapped her father's code in their own layers of brutalist encryption, but underneath it all, the original structure, his unique digital DNA, might still exist. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on a dead man's philosophical musings. She spent the next 48 hours in a fugue state, fueled by black coffee and sheer, unwavering determination. She wasn't hacking the system. She was communicating with it, using her father's own language. She applied his Fibonacci algorithm to the encrypted authorization codes, and for hours, nothing happened. The screen mocked her with failed attempts, but then, just as she was about to give up, a single line of code on the screen flickered, rearranged itself, and resolved into a string of plain text. It was a digital signature, an access stamp that had been hidden beneath 7 years of encryption. D. Sterling, override authorization, Alpha. She had it. The digital fingerprint on the weapon. The direct, undeniable link between the corporate titan and the petty act of digital burglary that had destroyed her family. A wave of triumphant, righteous vindication washed over her, so powerful it left her breathless. It was a victory shared with the ghost of her father, a testament to a brilliance that even Sterling's corporate machine could not fully erase. The cold, hard diamond of her resolve was now armed with the truth, a weapon sharper than any combat technique. She immediately sent a heavily encrypted message to Leo telling him he had done enough, that he needed to erase his tracks and disappear. His part in this war was over. He had been the key that opened the door, a brave man who had risked everything to do the right thing. His courage would not be in vain. Her victory, however, was short-lived. The very next day, an internal memo was leaked from Sterling Defense Systems. It was a company-wide announcement, personally signed by Damian Sterling. Effective immediately, the company was initiating a full-spectrum security overhaul, including a complete data integrity audit of all archival servers. The official reason given was a response to new, emerging global cyber threats. But Alara knew the truth. The incident at Aurelia had spooked him. He was a paranoid king, and the ghost at his feast had convinced him his castle walls were not as secure as he believed. He was searching for her, for the inexplicable breach in his perfect world. He was trying to bury the evidence, to scrub the digital history clean before anyone else could find what she had found. A ticking clock had just been activated. She didn't have months or weeks. She likely had only days before the servers Leo had accessed were locked down and wiped forever. The pressure was immense, a physical weight that settled on her shoulders. She had the proof, but proof was useless if it remained in the shadows. She needed a stage, a spotlight so bright it would incinerate Sterling's carefully constructed world of lies. She needed a way to present her evidence that was so public, so dramatic, that he would have no way to spin it, no corporate PR team that could contain the fallout. Attacking him legally would take years, a war of attrition she could not afford. The media was a possibility, but a story like this could be buried, dismissed as the ravings of a disgruntled former employee. No, the blow had to be personal. It had to be delivered in his own temple, on his own holy day, at the moment of his greatest triumph. And then she found it. Through a simple online search, The Sterling Defense Systems annual shareholder meeting, scheduled in less than a week at the Grand Hyatt Ballroom in Manhattan. It was the company's biggest event of the year, a live-streamed global spectacle where Sterling would stand before the world and boast about his company's record profits and ethical innovations. It was the perfect stage for his public execution. Getting inside would be impossible. Security for the event would be beyond stringent. A fortress of biometrics, metal detectors, and private security details that would make Aurelia look like a public park. She had the weapon, but she had no way to get it into the armory. This was a problem she could not solve with a pressure point or a piece of code. This required a different kind of key, a different kind of ally. She needed someone with legitimate access, someone the system would welcome through the front door. Racking her brain, she recalled Thorne's network of old contacts, the quiet alliances he maintained with people in every corner of the establishment. She reached out to him one last time with a new, urgent request. She didn't need a soldier or a spy. She needed a journalist. A specific kind of journalist. A tenacious, fearless financial reporter with a reputation for dismantling corporate corruption. Someone who had likely been trying to get a real look inside Sterling's empire for years. Thorne delivered. He provided her with the name and secure contact information for Anya Sharma, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist for the Wall Street Journal. Anya was a legend, a bulldog who had taken down 2 Fortune 500 CEOs with her relentless, meticulous reporting. She was also, as Thorne noted, one of the few journalists Sterling personally feared, and had therefore granted press credentials to his events, hoping to keep his enemy close. Ilara arranged a meeting, choosing a neutral public location. She found Anya to be exactly as advertised, sharp, cynical, and immediately suspicious. She listened to Ilara's story with a practiced skepticism, her eyes searching for any hint of falsehood or instability. Ilara didn't try to win her over with emotion. Instead, she laid out the facts, the cold, hard data. She showed her the decrypted logs, the timeline, the digital signature. She explained the technical nuances of her father's code, details so specific they could not have been fabricated. Anya's skepticism slowly melted away, replaced by the glint of a predator who has just caught the scent of the biggest story of her career. This wasn't just corporate fraud. It was the origin story of a titan's corruption, a tale of intellectual theft and human devastation that was both explosive and deeply personal. She agreed to help, her professional ethics and her human empathy aligning in a rare and powerful combination. The plan they formulated was simple in its concept, but breathtakingly audacious in its execution. Anya would register Ilara as her personal technical assistant for the shareholder meeting, giving her legitimate, credentialed access to the event. Once inside, while Anya created a diversion by engaging Sterling's PR team, Ilara would have a small window of opportunity to bypass the ballroom's internal security and gain access to the one system that could bring the entire empire crashing down. The audio-visual control booth that ran the main presentation screen behind the stage. The final days leading up to the meeting were a blur of meticulous preparation. Ilara spent hours studying the blueprints of the Grand Hyatt Ballroom, memorizing security camera placements, ventilation shafts, and access corridors. She used her meager savings to purchase the components needed to build a small, powerful signal hijacker, a device that could override the presentation feed at a critical moment. The work was a familiar comfort, the tactical planning, a return to a world where she was in control, where every variable could be accounted for, every contingency planned for. It was the physical expression of her mental war, the forging of the tools she would use to deliver the final, killing blow. The operative was fully awakened, every sense honed, every instinct sharpened to a razor's edge. On the eve of the confrontation, she did something she hadn't done in months. She took the long bus ride to the St. Jude's Extended Care Facility. She sat by her father's bedside in the quiet, sterile room, the only sounds, the gentle beep of a heart monitor, and his own shallow breathing. He was asleep, his face peaceful in the dim light. She didn't speak, knowing he couldn't hear her. Instead, she just watched him, the man whose genius had been stolen, whose life had been broken by a man who would be celebrated as a visionary the very next day. A profound, quiet promise formed in her heart. This was not about revenge anymore. Revenge was a hot, messy emotion, and what she felt was a cold, pure, and righteous sense of purpose. This was about reclamation. It was about taking back a stolen legacy, restoring a shattered name, and ensuring that the truth, her father's truth, would finally have its day in the sun. Back in her apartment, she laid out the simple, professional black pantsuit Anya had instructed her to wear. Beside it, she placed the small, discreet press pass with her new, temporary identity. It felt like a uniform, but this time, it was one she had chosen, a costume for the final act of a long and painful play. She held the plastic card in her hand, the key to the lion's den. The fear was still there, a low, electric hum in her veins, but it was overshadowed by a powerful, unshakable calm. The waitress was gone. The victim was gone. The soldier had done her reconnaissance, gathered her intelligence, and prepared her weapons. Tomorrow she was not infiltrating a meeting. She was deploying to a battlefield of her own choosing, ready to face the architect of her pain not as a ghost in the shadows, but as the arbiter of his long-overdue judgment. The stage was set for the checkmate, and the king had no idea he was already surrounded. The Grand Hyatt Ballroom was a cathedral built to the god of capital. The air hummed with the low, confident murmur of hundreds of conversations, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of global finance. It smelled of expensive cologne, freshly brewed coffee, and the crisp, clean scent of billions of dollars changing hands. On the main stage, a massive screen displayed the Sterling Defense Systems logo, a stylized eagle clutching a bundle of lightning bolts, projected in a light so bright it was almost divine. Ilara Vance moved through this temple not as a worshiper, but as an apostate. The simple black pantsuit and the press pass clipped to her lapel felt like a new kind of uniform, but this one was armor she had chosen, a shield for the battle to come. Her heart was not racing. It was a slow, steady metronome, each beat marking the final moments of a 7-year war. She scanned the room with the practiced eye of an operative, noting the placement of the private security guards, their sightlines, the subtle bulge of a weapon beneath a tailored jacket, the blind spots near the service corridors. Beside her, Anya Sharma was a study in professional calm, but Ilara could feel the coiled tension in her, the energy of a hunter who was about to witness the takedown of a lifetime. The memory of her father was not a source of pain in this moment. It was a guiding light, a silent, solemn banner she carried into the heart of the enemy's fortress. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the massive room. A professionally produced video began to play on the screen, a montage of sleek drones, stoic soldiers, and futuristic technology, all set to a triumphant orchestral score. Then, Damian Sterling walked onto the stage, and the room erupted in a wave of thunderous applause. He stood at the podium, bathed in a single, powerful spotlight, a modern-day emperor surveying his domain. He smiled, a wide, predatory grin that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. He soaked in the adoration, letting the applause wash over him, a baptism of ego. His voice, when he began to speak, was a smooth, confident baritone, amplified to fill every corner of the vast space. He spoke of growth, of shareholder value, of global stability through strength. He was a master showman, weaving a narrative of corporate responsibility and technological prowess that was as brilliant as it was false. As Sterling captivated his audience, Anya made her move. She walked directly to a group of senior executives standing near the press riser and, in a voice loud enough to be an interruption but professional enough to be plausible, began grilling them about a rumored SEC investigation into their offshore accounting practices. The executives, caught off guard, immediately became flustered, their attention and the attention of the nearest security detail completely consumed by this sudden, unexpected fire. It was the perfect diversion. In the carefully orchestrated chaos, Ilara detached from the crowd, a ghost melting into the shadows along the ballroom's edge. Her path to the audio-visual control booth now clear. The control booth was a small, dark room at the very back of the ballroom, a forgotten nerve center that ran the entire spectacle. A single guard stood at the door, his attention divided between the stage and the commotion Anya was causing. Ilara approached him not as a threat, but as a clumsy assistant. Her press pass was visible, her hands were full with a stack of files she had picked up. As she passed him, she feigned a stumble, the files scattering across the floor. It was a classic, almost cliché maneuver, but its effectiveness lay in its simplicity. The guard, sighing with annoyance, bent to help her, his back turned to the door for a critical 3 seconds. That was all she needed. She slipped inside the booth, the door clicking softly shut behind her. The room was cold, filled with the quiet hum of electronics. A single young technician sat at a massive console, his eyes glued to the dozen monitors displaying camera angles and data feeds. He was so engrossed in managing the live stream that he never even registered her presence. She moved behind him, a silent specter in the dim light. She didn't need to hurt him. She reached for a bundle of cables and gently disconnected a secondary monitor. The screen went black. The technician muttered a curse and turned in his chair, reaching down to find the loose connection. As he leaned over, exposing the back of his neck, Ilara's hand moved with surgical precision. A single, light tap, a mere whisper of contact on the vagus nerve. The technician's body went limp, his head slumping forward onto the console, overcome by a sudden, irresistible wave of sleep. The entire exchange was silent, efficient, and complete. She now had control of the king's castle. On the stage, Damian Sterling was nearing the grand finale of his speech, his voice swelling with manufactured passion. He gestured to the logo on the screen behind him, his tone filled with the pride of a creator. And our greatest achievement, the crown jewel of our innovation, is the Aegis drone navigation system, he boomed. A technology developed entirely in-house, by the greatest minds in the industry. It is a testament to our vision, our dedication, and our unparalleled commitment to building a safer world through our own unique ingenuity. This was the cue. This was the moment of ultimate hubris, the lie he was broadcasting to the entire world. Ilara's fingers danced across the control panel. She inserted the small, custom-built signal hijacker into a shielded USB port, a key she had forged in the fire of her own grief and determination. She executed a short string of commands, and on the massive screen behind Sterling, the proud eagle logo flickered for less than a second. It was a nearly imperceptible glitch, but Sterling saw it. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, a momentary crack in his perfect, polished performance. He dismissed it, completely unaware that he had just lost control of his own narrative. The ghost was now in his machine, and she was about to burn his kingdom to the ground. As Sterling opened his mouth to deliver his final triumphant line about a future built on unshakable integrity, Ilara initiated the full override. The screen behind him did not just flicker, it went black for a full second, a moment of dramatic, visual silence that drew the focus of every eye in the room. Then, it snapped back to life, not with the corporate logo, but with a stark, split-screen image that was an indictment in digital form. On the left side of the screen, her father's original hand-drawn schematics appeared, followed by his elegant, time-stamped code, dated 7 years prior. On the right side, the nearly identical schematics for Sterling's patented Aegis system, dated 6 months later. The theft was laid bare, a story told in lines and numbers that no lawyer could refute. A collective, audible gasp swept through the ballroom. The live stream, broadcasting to millions of investors, partners, and government agencies, was now a conduit for Sterling's public execution. The screen changed again, this time to a single damning line of text, magnified 100 times. D. Sterling. Override authorization. Alpha. Sterling froze, the words dying on his lips. He turned, his body moving as if in slow motion, and stared at the colossal screen that was broadcasting the secret, foundational crime of his entire empire. The spotlight that had made him look like a god now pinned him like a specimen, exposing him for the fraud he truly was. The world seemed to stop. The profound, suffocating silence that filled the Grand Hyatt ballroom was heavier than any sound. The applause, the murmurs, the triumphant music, all of it was gone, replaced by the deafening roar of a truth finally unleashed. Hundreds of cell phones were now held aloft, their small red lights blinking as they recorded the utter and complete implosion of a titan. Damian Sterling stood on the stage, a statue of crumbling arrogance. His face, which had been a mask of confident power, now seemed to melt, the features sagging, the skin turning a pale, waxy gray. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was a king whose throne had just been vaporized beneath him. At that moment, Ilara stepped out from the shadows of the control booth and walked with a calm, deliberate pace to a microphone on the press riser. She didn't look at Sterling. She looked at the audience, at the cameras, at the world. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and steady, cutting through the stunned silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "My name is Ilara Vance," she said, her words echoing through the hall and across the globe. "The man whose genius you see on that screen was my father, Robert Vance. Damian Sterling did not create that technology. He stole it from a better man, drove him to ruin, and built this entire company on a foundation of lies and stolen honor." Sterling finally found his voice, but it was not the commanding baritone of a CEO. It was a weak, ragged whisper, a pathetic plea. "Security," he croaked. "Get her out of here." But the security guards were frozen, their eyes, like everyone else's, locked on the damning evidence displayed on the screen. Their loyalty to a paycheck momentarily eclipsed by the raw, undeniable power of the scene unfolding before them. The emperor was not just naked, he was a thief, and his entire court was his witness. Type "Justice" in the comments if you got chills when Ilara Vance finally exposed the truth for the whole world to see. The fallout was not a slow decline, it was a cataclysm, an extinction-level event for Sterling Defense Systems. Before the shareholder meeting had even officially ended, the company's stock had entered a free fall from which it would never recover. By the time the markets closed, it was worthless, a digital ghost of its former value. The Department of Defense, facing a scandal of monumental proportions, immediately froze all contracts and launched the largest corporate fraud investigation in its history. News channels across the globe played the clip of Ilara's speech on a continuous loop, her calm, steady voice narrating the downfall of a modern-day Goliath. Damian Sterling was arrested later that day, not in his gleaming office tower, but in his fortified panic room, a cowering, broken man whose empire had been dismantled by a single, undeniable truth. His trial was swift, the evidence against him so overwhelming that his army of high-priced lawyers could do nothing but watch as he was convicted and sentenced to decades in federal prison, a fate he would have once considered an amusing impossibility for a man of his stature. The legal system, so often a tool of the powerful, had for once bent in the direction of justice, forced into action by the sheer, undeniable weight of the evidence Ilara had brought into the light. In the wake of the corporate wreckage, a quieter, more profound victory took place. A landmark civil settlement, funded by the seizure of Sterling's personal assets, was awarded to the estate of Robert Vance. His name was not only cleared but celebrated, his genius finally recognized by the industry he had helped to shape. A charitable foundation was established in his name, a multi-billion-dollar entity dedicated to providing legal and financial support to independent inventors and whistleblowers who had been victimized by corporate predators. But the greatest victory was not financial. In the quiet, sterile room at St. Jude's, something remarkable happened. With his name restored and the crushing weight of a false legacy lifted, a light began to return to Robert Vance's eyes. The recovery was slow, arduous, but it was real. For the first time in years, he looked at his daughter and whispered her name, a single word that was worth more than all the money in the world. Laura, however, did not retreat from the world she had just shaken to its core. Her actions had been noticed. She was approached by the CEO of a rival technology firm, a company known for its ethical innovations, a company Sterling had nearly crushed years earlier. They did not offer her a job. They offered her a purpose. They created a new division, a global security and strategic risk analysis unit, and asked her to build it from the ground up, to infuse it with her principles of honor, courage, and unwavering integrity. The final image of her story is not one of vengeance, but of ascension. Laura Vance stands in her new office, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that offer a panoramic view of the New York City skyline. The city that was once her hunting ground is now a landscape of possibility. She wears a simple, impeccably tailored suit, not as a disguise or a uniform, but as a symbol of the authority she has earned, the power she has reclaimed. She is no longer a ghost, no longer a victim, no longer a soldier fighting a secret war. She is a guardian, a protector, using the very skills forged in the darkness of a corrupt system to build a shield for the innocent. Her past is not a scar she hides, but a map that guides her, a constant reminder that true strength is not found in the ability to dominate, but in the courage to defend. She has transformed her family's pain into a global force for good, ensuring that no other brilliant mind would be broken, no other family would be shattered by the unchecked arrogance of the powerful. She has honored her father's legacy not by destroying his enemy, but by building a better world, proving that the most profound justice is not about retribution, but about reclamation and the enduring power of a single, unwavering voice speaking the truth. If Laura Vance's incredible journey from an invisible waitress to an unstoppable force for justice inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories where the truth always wins, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.